As somebody who works in the field of environmental and science policy, it's a rare treat to associate with people interested in science. As you know, the Environmental Protection Agency has declared, and the Senate just shrugged last week, its collective shoulders at the notion that carbon dioxide endangers human health and the environment. When I go out and argue the other side, I get the lovely emails and voicemails. If you love carbon dioxide so much, why don't you leave your engine running in your garage? Senator Lincoln Chafee quizzed Dick Lindzen at a Senate hearing about, of course this is a problem. Otherwise we wouldn't have all these people asphyxiating themselves in their garage every year. To which Professor Lindzen said, well, Senator, and Dick doesn't suffer fools at all, and yet he said very kindly and patiently, Senator, I think your question really illustrates my point, that this is really an issue of education. I barely even got it, but Senator Reid grabbed the mic and said, you're belittling Senator Chafee, who's looking around cluelessly, not even knowing why he was being belittled or how. And of course, President Obama has said, dangerous carbon dioxide is polluting the water we drink. Put down that Perrier. Could I hit the lights? As Mr. Gore has shown, this is a very visual medium, even text slides, but as I say, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely, so I'm thoroughly corrupted. Going to go through, we might have to wake up the machine, it's been a while. Some slides, some may be familiar to some of you, and I'll cover the gamut. The science was adequately covered, the scam of the science and so on was covered earlier, but we're now into rebranding global warming, as you heard, and it's no longer, the issue's not the issue for our friends, as is so often the case, it's whatever might work. But I'm going to step back briefly and start where I like to start, generally on campus talks, with a picture that drives students a little crazy, because they generally don't know who that man in the front of the boat is. Now, answers range from former slave owner to someone instrumental in the founding of one of the nations that's on the UN Security Council's 5 permanent seats. But the more important aspect that I like to point out is, what is that stuff in the water? Because I live not too far from there, and we certainly don't see that anymore. I'm sorry, I'm in your way. It is, and they're very relieved when I tell them, it is because of global warming that they don't see ice in the rivers all that often, though they might get used to it soon. But it's no longer there so often because of global warming. The same reason, of course, the Thames no longer has these lovely scenes of frost fairs and so on. In fact, in the town where I live, Charlottesville, Virginia, just outside, I can see the hill on which Mr. Jefferson's home sits. And he wrote about, not climate change, he wrote about global warming, and he wrote about it quite a lot. He wrote about his friends in the Siena province telling him of a warming on the continent at a rate of 1 degree per century by Mr. Fahrenheit's thermometer. Mr. Fahrenheit's thermometer was located over different airport runways, barbecue grills, and other places then than it is now. But still, a little consistency and homogeneity issues. But Mr. Jefferson wrote about global warming. For example, Notes on the State of Virginia, 1781, and I'll read this. It's a dense text slide. But he wrote, snows are less frequent and less deep. They do not often lie below the mountains more than 1, 2, or 3 days, and very rarely a week. They're remembered to have been formerly frequent, deep, and of long continuance. The elderly inform me the earth used to be covered with snow about 3 months in every year, and why they walked uphill to and from school both ways in it. The rivers, which then seldom failed to freeze over in the course of the winter, scarcely ever do so now. And he went on and on a bit about this, detailing the warming. And the only thing really that distinguishes this from a story in the New York Times today are 3 words. Not George W. Bush, but at this rate. Now, Thomas Jefferson was not grinding an axe, he was not an alarmist, he was not pushing an agenda by blaming his neighbor for the weather. He was just chronicling what was going on. He was a diarist, he was a climatologist, I suppose, as they were of the age. He was a horticulturalist, a vintner, and so on, and he was recording that climate was changing. In fact, it was getting warmer, and has continued, and so on. But now we're living in a different time, as you know, and suddenly it's our neighbor's fault again. We had about 200, 250 years where we stopped blaming our neighbor for the weather, with very unhappy results. And then it's our time again. Now somebody, I think it was Chris Ruddy, raised the issue of that famous, infamous New York Times article in which they said, Ages-old ice cap at North Pole is now liquid, scientists find. I pulled this slide out because I wanted to do this justice. The last time scientists can be certain the pole was awash in water was more than 50 million years ago. Or when these subs surfaced in 59, 62, 87, inconveniently taken. This was staged like the moon landing, of course, we all believe that. This was actually on a sound stage in LA somewhere. So, of course, we're not dealing with reasoned, measured, rational people. I was just speaking to Hugh here a moment ago, and he was saying, why would the Greens do the following? And I said, Hugh, you are seeking to ascribe rational thought to where you probably shouldn't seek to ascribe rational thought. So here's a quick recap. This is Say Anything. The issue is not the issue. It's global warming, it's climate change, it's now national security. It's the same vehicle, but they're willing to say anything. In fact, as you'll see, even according to the proponents of this agenda's own admissions, the issue is no longer the issue. They even now admit it's about whatever sells. As you'll see, and you know there is no good reason for an agenda when the reason for the agenda or the excuse is constantly changing. And the reason for this agenda constantly changes while the objective, the vehicle, the objective remains the same. The vehicle changes. Cap and trade, we're told now by the wise men in Washington that, well, if you're going to have a European-style social welfare state, you're going to need European-style taxation and revenues, and the VAT is the only gusher of revenue that will provide what's needed to underwrite this welfare state. That's not true. As you'll see, using FOIA, we know that this administration expects hundreds of billions of dollars every year in taxes taken from you under cap and trade. It's a VAT. It's added at every stage throughout commerce, although unlike a VAT, it appears on no receipts. And you are constantly, of course, increasing the take. It requires billions, not from big business, of course. Businesses pass on taxes until they can't, and then they leave. It is billions from us, laundered through industry, who are the ones at the table cutting the deal. Green jobs is now the new excuse. That's an ideological push. It will result in a European-style disaster, and it has resulted in a disaster in Europe, as you'll see. So, the agenda. The peril is actually abundant, affordable energy. You all know the quotes from the longtime soldiers in the anti-population, global warming, climate change, global cooling movement who say things like, it would be finding an affordable, abundant source of reliable energy would be like giving an idiot child a machine gun and so on. That is the threat. George Will wrote a column in October in which he stated this very nicely. He said the concept of affordable, abundant energy, quote, horrifies people who relish scarcity because scarcity requires, or so they say, government to ration what is scarce and to generally boss people to mend their behavior. Today, there is a name for the political doctrine that rejoices in scarcity of everything except government, and the name is environmentalism. The footnote is that actually is, of course, the name of the current governing class's agenda as well. It is enthusiastic about dramatically increasing everything except your liberties, and what's key to your liberties is affordable, abundant, reliable energy. The environmental agenda, if you think about it, break it down, you'll realize they seek to use the state to create scarcity as a means of imposing their will upon you. Their objective of organizing society, as they put it, never changes. The only thing that changes is the vehicle. What is the latest victim to be rescued from the horrors of what I'll just oversimplify as capitalism? It used to be the worker. The worker threw off that yoke under a different ism, and now it's the environment to be protected from the horrors of individual liberty. That changes. The vehicle changes. What's fashionable changes. By the way, I snuck away to watch the U.S.-England soccer match today, and after the U.S. tied thanks to a bad muff by their goalie named Green, the ESPN announcers were having great fun with this, saying, well, you know, it's really fashionable to go green, but England's very sorry it went green today. He was a substitute goalie. Soccer joke. That changes. The fashionable vehicle changes. Green jobs. Yeah. It's now climate, and it's now morphing to clean energy, as you'll see. And this is actually the result of a poll taken by President Clinton's former pollster, as I'll note later. That's why the same legislation is now called something completely different. So, how bad do they want it to get? Well, we have an energy and climate czar who sits in that position, which is a phony position. It was created for her because she would never survive Senate scrutiny and would never subject herself to the disclosure. And she would cause great political harm, would she try. I call her Hal. Her name is Carol Browner. You'll see why I call her Hal in a moment. She gave an interview to U.S. News in which she said, We need to make sure that eventually we get to a system where an electric company will be able to hold back some power from you. You'll still be able to cool your home, she said, just not as much as you would like. Meaning just as much as who would like? Hal, I'm afraid I can't open those vents for you. This mission's far too important to allow you to jeopardize it. No, she said, but that'll be a savings to the consumer. You see, the poor dears can't navigate that thermostat with an up and a down arrow. Imagine all the savings in Haiti and Africa and other places right now. It's sold as a savings to you, but in fact, it's about power. Remember, the president gave a speech that in isolation just sounded weird. He said you can't eat what you want, drive what you want, or put your thermostat where you want. What is the President of the United States doing with that sort of concern as a priority agenda? In fact, you recall during one of the debates, he said this would be his #1 priority. Well, because it's a vehicle, it's not about the climate, of course, or warming or cooling. It's a consistent excuse for the agenda. Somebody noted earlier, Timothy Worth in 1988, during the time that he held a very famous hearing kicking off inventing this issue, Senator Tim Worth, who was working with a senator from Tennessee and now works for Ted Turner running the UN Foundation, said we need to try to ride the global warming issue. Even if the theory of global warming is wrong, to have approached global warming as if it's real means doing the right thing. We just need to use it as an excuse. Yes. If you saw the President's State of the Union address, you saw him say almost exactly the same thing. He said, after that great applause line in which almost half of the chamber laughed uproariously for a sustained period of time, when he said the overwhelming scientific evidence right on the heels of ClimateGate, 5 weeks after ClimateGate, and the place fell apart. And he said, with a nod to the rather underwhelming state of the science, he said, even if you doubt the evidence, it's the right thing to do. 22 years later, it's the right thing to do. I can't make my case, therefore I'm just going to say it's the right thing to do and continue throwing out excuse after excuse after excuse as to why you need to do what I call the right thing. Well, this is just a quick history lesson to recall because Calamity James Hansen has had his name taken in vain several times here. I want to remind you, this is 1988, June 24th, right after the Senate global warming hearing that kicked off the issue, in fact invented the issue, chaired by Senator Worth. And the New York Times wrote, global warming has begun, expert tells Senate. This was a stagecraft hearing. You can see it on Frontline. It's online. You can watch the episode in which Senator Worth says, we knew there was this scientist at NASA, you know, who had really identified the impact before anybody else had. A bit of a moonbat. And he had this theory, man, okay, it's no longer cooling, there are just enough of me, way too many of you, you're heating up the planet. And so Worth and Gore called him to testify, and we said, Deborah Amos is the interviewer, she said, on Capitol Hill, Senator Worth was one of the few politicians already concerned about global warming, and he was not above using a little stagecraft for Hansen's testimony. Worth said, we called the Weather Bureau and found out what historically was the hottest day of the summer. Well, it was June 6th or 9th or whatever it was, so we scheduled the hearing for that day. And bingo, it was the hottest day on record in Washington or close to it. It didn't stop there, that's good politicking, I suppose. But then Deborah Amos asked him, did you also alter the temperature in the hearing room that day? And he said, well, what we did is we went in the night before and opened all the windows, I will admit, right? So that the air conditioning wasn't working inside the room on the hottest day of the year in Washington, a swamp. Now, you can't control the climate or temperature in an individual Dirksen or Russell hearing room any more than we can control the climate outside. So you had to open the windows to defeat the air conditioning, and right before the media came in for this afternoon hearing, you rushed to close them. And he said, so when the hearing occurred, there was not only bliss, which is television cameras in double figures, but it was really hot. The wonderful Jim Hansen was mopping his brow at the table at the hearing at the witness table and giving this remarkable testimony. So 1988 is very important. In 1991, in its 25th anniversary back-patting self-congratulatory episode, the Club of Rome, who you may have heard about, there's a bunch of Malthusians who again embody this idea that there's just enough of them, way too many of you and me, and if we get wealthy, we'll have babies and the earth can't handle that. Well, they said, to attain public acceptance of their anti-growth Malthusian agenda, quote, new enemies therefore have to be identified, new strategies imagined, new weapons devised. In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea of pollution and global warming would fit the bill. This was 1991. taking credit for something that had been invented for political purposes just 3 years before. Just so you know, it's not just this evil oil company that used to supposedly buy the debate. It's actually a lot of individuals and a very well-funded movement that sees the world rather differently than you and I, who actually are driving it. Now the issue is whatever might work. The cap-and-trade bill, John Kerry said, in trying to distance it from Earth Day moon battery about five weeks ago, said, this is not an environment bill. This is John Kerry about the cap-and-trade bill, which, as Mark pointed out, he also said it's not a cap-and-trade bill because he doesn't know what that means. But the global warming bill is not an environment bill. Senator Lindsey Graham just said at the same time, it's not a global warming bill to me because global warming is a reason to pass legislation doesn't exist anymore. I still want to pass it. You still have to do it. I still need to seize your freedoms and your revenues to run my program, but the reason keeps changing. It doesn't have a good reason. And the reason they were all running away is this most disturbing of all magazine covers that Mark showed that Senator Inhofe graciously brought to the floor of the Senate. ClimateGate. The reason everyone was scrambling to say, oh, this global warming bill? No, that's not a global warming. That's not an environment bill at all. It's a, I don't know, what appeals to you bill. It's now a national security bill. It's a jobs bill because that's what we all know energy tax increases create. This is a little blurry, but this is the alternate view of ClimateGate. I keep going everywhere I go to speak, and I'm told essentially the Black Knight skit in Monty Python, it's nothing but a flesh wound, come back and fight, you coward. Meanwhile, we've had ClimateGate, NASAGate, all the IPCC gates, and they lied there bloody stumped saying, come back and fight, you coward. What ClimateGate did was we finally settled that settled thing. Judith Curry rushed to publish an open letter to the public. She heads the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech. And she wrote, no one really believes the science is settled or that the debate is over. Now you have to understand, she has long been one of the spokespeople for the movement, like Phil Jones, who also said the same thing to the BBC. I don't believe that, he said. I don't think anybody I know, but the majority of scientists don't believe that. They've been dining out on this, nothing to see here. The only thing we can't afford is debate. Line for 15 years. Now she said, I don't know anybody believes that. In fact, scientists and others who say this seem to want to advance a particular agenda, Dr. Curry said with suspicion, cocking an eyebrow. There is nothing more detrimental to public trust than such statements. For example, when the Obama administration came up 2 weeks later to testify, Lisa Jackson, EPA head, said, the science behind climate change is settled, defiantly. Who's lying? That's what you need to ask. Sometimes it's, which time are you lying? This is who's lying. Why is Judith Curry lying to me? I mean, they're telling me this. Why is Phil Jones lying? Why are all the rest of them saying, oh, settled? We never said that. This is, as Judith Curry said, people who are driving an agenda, people who have an axe to grind. It's not because the science is settled. And again, as you know, the best way to pressure test whether the science is settled is to say, so can I spend that $7 billion somewhere else productively? You'll figure out how settled it is real quickly. It's such an ugly word, you're told. Cap and trade, all climate policies share the same ultimate objectives. And again, like in the book Power Grab, I just quote them and ask you, why should you believe they're lying to you here? Or are they all telling the truth? Which is it? When the president said, as a candidate under my plan of a cap and trade system, electricity prices would necessarily skyrocket. Was he lying? No, he's not actually. This is proof that one is not economically illiterate. That's the point. Is there another point of cap and trade besides getting it without voting on a direct, transparent tax? No, that's the point of cap and trade. It's the purpose, to coerce me out of my lifestyle without getting caught voting for a direct, transparent tax. Necessary, that is, according to the Treasury Secretary, if you're going to change how people use energy, meaning how much. If $8 gasoline and windmill mandates would force the invention of pixie dust and flying cars and defeat of the laws of physics, it would have happened in Europe after decades. That's not really what it's about. But we need to do this, cause your electricity prices and all others to necessarily skyrocket because you're going to change how people use energy, you see. This would also raise billions of dollars, according to the president. There's that one other thing. How many billions? Well, using FOIA, one Treasury Department memo written about 6 days after the president's election said, okay, he wants to do this. Here's how and here's why. And under justification was the heading. They said, could raise, quote, possibly up to several percentage points of GDP, parentheses, i.e. the equivalent of the corporate income tax. Now we have, as you know, a very high corporate income tax rate. It raises $400 billion per year. That's what the Treasury Department said, unless, again, they were lying to themselves. You remember the old Clinton aide who said I was lying to my diary? I didn't. Well, in their internal memos, they're lying to themselves. $400 billion a year. And then when all of this came out and the president's quote on YouTube came out and all of the sages from the Hill rushed and said, no, I figured out something in here. It won't cost anything. It won't do anything if it didn't cost anything. Again, you've got to push them on this. Treasury was not lying to us. They were writing among themselves saying we could, if we pull this off, we'll eat like kings, as the old Far Side cartoon had the spiders on the playground slide. It is the most, Mark showed us this, the most significant revenue-generating proposal of our time. Senator Benjamin Cardin of Maryland to the Washington Post. Now, was he lying? Was the Post always on my team? Was they just distorting his remarks? Or was this actually the point? It's we don't have tax increases since 1993. We have revenue enhancements or revenue-generating proposals. This is the most significant revenue-generating proposal of our time. That's big. That's actually the point. Of course, this is Chip Knappenberger, a climate scientist who modeled out the impact that reminds us the temperature after cap and trade would be whatever it would have been. It's not about the temperature. It's unreasonable to conclude it's about the temperature. Nobody says it would do anything. And when you raise this, they say, well, it's the first of 30 steps. I thought it was urgent just over the hill in Shelbyville right now. We're accelerating and all, whatever it is now. Now it's the first of 30 steps. It's not about the climate. It's unreasonable to. If this is a moral issue, as its proponents say, this is a very curious response, isn't it? In fact, therefore, you have the high ground. They say, you support doing nothing. Well, so do you. I just say, don't do any harm. So, here's what it is. It's rationing. We use that word promiscuously now, but cap, that's the first big flag. It's rationing. It's World War II style rationing. The state decides how much of something the private sector can have. It assigns a ration, a quota. It gives out ration coupons, or you can euphemize them and call them energy use allowances. I don't know who's fooled by that, but they're going to great effort to call it an allowance. But you can sell them, you see. That's the trading part. But don't be fooled. This is, the ration coupons are allocated politically. They actually are allocated in the bill. They're not, this is the market doesn't determine it. Just because buying and selling are involved does not make something a market mechanism, okay? The bill politically allocates the ration coupons to the politically favored entities who then resell them to some poor sap who does not have the same lobbying budget. But have no illusions. They are politically allocated to, coincidentally, the people lobbying for this. The president gave a talk and he said why some of America's biggest companies support this. That was his evidence why it's a good thing. And nobody, the scribblers all said, No one said why. Why is very important. They've all set up a scheme to pay for it. I'll tell you how I was dragged into this issue, but that is the point. That's why some of America's biggest companies, this is not sudden virtue. This is, individuals have principles, businesses have business plans. They're not mutually exclusive, though rarely the twain meet. In this case, it's not principle, it's not green, it's obviously not about the environment or climate. Cap and trade is a tax and a great big one. According to John Dingell, the longest serving member of Congress, ergo somebody who knows taxes, great, big, and otherwise. He wasn't lying to us when he said that. And by the way, he's a supporter of cap and trade. Now this is a slide I owe to Mark Burano. Greenpeace, of course, the people, they were actually taking my trash every week. I discovered this Sunday nights because I'd go out and play ball with my dogs in the back, and I noticed my trash was the only among all my neighbors gone. I have a more realistic view of my expectations of government, so imagine my surprise when my trash was being uniquely and selectively, efficiently delivered or taken away. I found out it was Greenpeace. I had some fun. These dogs are large breed dogs. It was about this time of year. They were very productive, and I was assiduous about my compliance with local ordinances of picking up after the beasts. So anyway, Greenpeace and I had a love-hate relationship. The most of the green stuff is verging on a gigantic scam. James Lovelock, the Gaia Theory green guru. It wouldn't do anything. Greenpeace has said, I love saying this with any testimony, Senator, I'm with Greenpeace on this one. I'm with Friends of the Earth on this. How hard is that for a member of Congress to say? We gave passes, actually, to 7 Republicans. We were in a meeting, and the leadership brought a bunch of folks together, and they said, we really need your support on this vote that's coming later today. And a colleague of mine had a message on his BlackBerry and said, Representative, I won't say your name, I have an email here from a lobbyist who's very close to you who says you've given passes to 7 Republicans on this vote. Is that true? And one congressman in leadership, who will go without name, felt for his cigarettes and walked out of the room. One who I know, who doesn't like to lie, looked at his shoes and slowly slid out, leaving this poor young man there to say, I can't deny that, with a tone that meant I can't confirm that. But anyway, we know how the vote went. There were 7 Republicans who could not be reached by economic arguments, who couldn't also be reached by, I'm with Friends of the Earth on this. It's bulletproof. I'm with Greenpeace on this. It's all pain, no gain. Subprime carbon is how Friends of the Earth has been describing in a series of actually very good papers since last April, a year plus ago, explaining how the folks who climbed out of the rubble they caused on Wall Street with the assistance of the state have now climbed out and determined their new fund. They've called this our new playground. I smell bucks to be made. Nirvana is what one called it. And huge bucks to be made. I quote all these folks in Power Grab. They're all just designing a new market. But again, because buying and selling are involved doesn't make it a market mechanism. You're just using the state to create artificial scarcity for something you can trade. And then wet your beak at both ends. Here's some insight on cap and trade from 2 EPA Region 9 lawyers. And yes, that means San Francisco. So EPA Region 9 lawyers, I can think of at least 3 things wrong with this, and yet they're right. Cap and trade, unlike a fee or a tax, a cap requires Soviet-style pre-planning. That was not intended as a compliment. Easily subject to gaming and manipulation, creating artificial scarcity that is likely to result in disruptions and unfairness. A preview of such disruptions was provided by the market manipulations that created the California energy crisis early in this decade. When I say California energy crisis, market manipulations, does any company's name come to mind? Right. On campus, I get, who? Bush is gone. Why would I know what Enron is? Or usually when I talk about this, the weather stations and the Soviets, I get this look, Soviets? Enron invented carbon cap and trade. The reason I know that is I was in the room. I had a glorious 3-week career as Director of Federal Government Relations for Enron 13 years ago. And on my 2nd day, I sat in for Mr. Lay at a meeting of something called the Business Council for Sustainable Development. And I was there with the American Gas Association, Niagara Mohawk Power, BP, who was actually the co-leader with Mr. Lay, and the Union of Concerned Scientists, and other similarly measured groups. And I leaned over to one guy, very naive at the point. 13 years ago, of course, I was very young. And didn't understand rent seeking, and I said, what are we doing sitting around a table with people who want to put us out of business? And the guy laughed and said, I don't know, but they want to put coal out of business first. Well, I'm back in my office. Can they do that? You know, Houston, we have a problem. Do you have any idea what this group you're co-chairing is up to? This was essentially a no-interview job offer I'd received. I didn't really understand Enron's business plan, and they then thoroughly explained it to me. They had bought, on the cheap, a bunch of uneconomic businesses that nobody wanted in order to then pay green groups to scare people into accepting an agenda that added value to these investments. Rent-seeking, world's 2nd oldest profession. Example, world's largest windmill company. It's now called GE Wind, but for a time it was called Enron Wind. Before that it was Zond. Enron bought it in 96, 7, and now GE has it. And GE is very responsible on this issue now. They had the world's 2nd largest solar panel interest with Amoco. Now BP has that. And BP was, well, on August 4th, 1997, there was a meeting in the Oval Office with Ken Lay, Sir John Brown, Bill Clinton, and Al Gore. And you can find the August 1st briefing memo for Ken Lay up online at the Master Resource website, among other internal great documents. And in it, they're explaining to Mr. Lay what he has to tell the President and the Vice President on Monday. I know the Senate unanimously voted, according to that document, the Constitution, Article 2, Section 2, advice and consent. It gets so tiresome, but the Senate offered unsolicited advice. Don't go to Kyoto and agree to that thing. When you go into the Oval Office on Monday, tell them the first thing is you have to go to Kyoto and agree to that thing. Here's what it has to include. It's got to have cap and trade and so on. You can exempt India and China. We've got this great business. We're planning on building coal-fired power plants in India and China, so it's okay. There was a joke inside Enron, by the way, which really did believe they were all the smartest guys in the room. They had this failure in India trying to build a giant power plant there. And the joke was, only Enron could be so arrogant as to believe they could sell turbines to the Indians. Turbines. So, Ken Lay. Thank you. Thanks. My cousin came. Kyoto is exactly what I've been lobbying for. So this Oval Office meeting comes a week plus after the unanimous Senate instruction, don't go to Kyoto and do this. This is 3 months after I'm gone and 3 weeks after raising some questions, an email that didn't go over well. Great stories I can tell you later about how they responded. It wasn't well. And so I'm gone. They continue on, of course, without me somehow. And they meet in the Oval Office with the President and the Vice President and say, we need this. Well, I know the media can't get this right, but we did, of course, we did go to Kyoto and agree to that treaty, but we signed Kyoto. We signed Kyoto on November 12, 1998. George Bush could no more sign Kyoto. You recall 7 years of keening from the New York Times about Bush's refusal to sign Kyoto. The Washington Post wrote about it. Associated Press wrote 20 stories about Bush refusing to sign a treaty he could no more sign than he could sign. The Treaty of Versailles and finally put an end to the horrors of World War I. And nobody ever pushed back. The White House never said, well, actually, Clinton signed it. We never unsigned it. This is not about, the issue wasn't the issue. This was about politics. It was a totem in the anti-Bush struggle. So we agreed to this. We signed it. And we agreed to it at the urging of companies like particularly BP and Enron. Why? This agreement will be good for Enron stock. 2 exclamation marks. If implemented, that needed 3, if implemented, this agreement will do more to promote Enron's business than will any other regulatory initiative, for the reasons I just described. Enron now has excellent credentials with many green interests, including Greenpeace, WWF, NRDC, Climate Action Network, and so on. This position should be increasingly cultivated and capitalized upon, misspelled and in parentheses, but you get it, monetized. Those guys could scare those guys into sacrificing those liberties and that money to buy this stuff. That's essentially the business plan. And then, of course, their doppelganger was BP and their new slogan, bringing oil to American shores. But they really were the ones behind this. They did invent this. Of course, climate, global warming, was an issue, but it wasn't going anywhere until certain individuals realized, well, I could make a buck off this. And suddenly it found political traction. Not overnight, but remember, this Business Council for Sustainable Development has a component, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. Go on their website, it's very troubling. Their view of what industry should contribute to society, and it's really all about, they view the wealth-creating sector of the economy with great suspicion, and they view it really as a wealth transfer mechanism. And these companies are falling over themselves to sign up for it because it shows how much they care. It's a marketing tool, like the fellow on ESPN said today. But climate, the issue is not actually about the climate. It has great utility, however. There's a company called Exelon, a Chicago-based utility, created by a guy named Rahm Emanuel, actually. He made $16 million on the deal, fairly new company. Forbes walked through all this in a story, the cover of which says, Exelon cashing in on carbon taxes. They got it right. Cap and trade is a tax. CBO's been saying it for years. Everybody knows it's a tax. It's just an indirect, non-transparent tax. And in it, they profile and interview John Rowe, the man who says, the CEO of Exelon. Exelon's John Rowe has been planning for expensive carbon for a decade. Now it's time to push for the payoff. Guess what the payoff is? According to this, they actually understate the case. It's actually $1.1 to $1.5 billion per year, according to Exelon. Sanford Bernstein, the investment analyst, said the same thing. In windfall profits, which is not a profit made by an oil company, but a profit dropped into the lap of a politically favored entity, in this case, Exelon, for doing nothing. I'll show you some quotes from the article in a moment, but you'll see it's actually simply plopped into their lap for no capital investment, no innovation, no defeat of the laws of physics, nothing they did superior to others except for lobbying. AEP, their CEO, Mike Morris, gave an interview to the same magazine a few months before in which he said, you know, you'd think this would cost us a lot of money as the country's biggest coal burner, but in fact it's a bit of a paradox, he said. You see, the beauty of the system is it will cost us billions, this is one utility, but we get to pass it all through to the consumer with a little taste on top for ourselves, for our trouble. He said, so actually, it doesn't cost us as you would think at all. And he's very open about it. BP, G, others, simply promoting to be rewarded for investments presumably made on their merits, but now which must be rewarded because things didn't turn out as planned, or this was the plan. Regardless, it's not about the climate. The scheme didn't reduce emissions in Europe. It's not designed to reduce emissions. Here's how you know. Europe's emissions, just like the Bush refused to sign Kyoto things, that's a mythology. Europe's CO2 emissions went up after they signed and ratified Kyoto, not down. And they went up faster than ours. That's right. Why? Because we were seeking to pull through new technology. We were focusing on economic growth, and that actually had the co-benefit of pulling through new technology through new investment, like that steel facility in Carroll County, Kentucky, which is a Spanish company. The CEO of which, now retired, said, I'm not investing in a new steel plant in Europe. I have to buy ration coupons from the French. We have blackouts. You can make windmills out of steel, but you can't make steel using windmills. I'm out of here. And he went to Columbia, South Africa, and Carroll County, Kentucky. And so you're stuck with your old investments, and they will run their capital investments into the ground, and then they will invest elsewhere. The CEO of this company, the new one, has told the professor, Gabriel Calzada, the green jobs guy, the guy who I'll show in a second debunked the green jobs myth that the president was pushing. He said, Gabriel, we made a terrible mistake. If they do this, we're going to Malaysia. Now, we all wish we knew more rich people, but if we meet some more, tell them we need support to bring Europeans over here and say this. We need support to bring steelworkers from Kentucky to Washington and raise heck. And just say it. I owe my job to cap and trade. Europe's cap and trade. What about this newest European import don't you like? Because you will not get those jobs here. It isn't designed to reduce emissions for one reason. Everything that is for political sale, that is anything that's brought to the finish line for vote, has to include offset schemes. Now, offsets are indulgences. They make sure you don't actually have to engage in the really painful, economically costly stuff. But later you will have to, because again, the ration keeps getting tightened. And so you'll have offset schemes of various varieties, but one of which, of course, is the tree planting variety. You get 80 years of projected tree growth in one accounting year. The tree never dies, in theory, and returns the carbon to what it's called the carbon cycle, somebody told me. It's an accounting fiction. It is being promoted by, of course, the big, whatever they are now, 5? It actually is. PricewaterhouseCoopers was very aggressive on this. Enron had their own schemes. The offset schemes ensure no reductions need occur. That's why Europe's emissions didn't go down, even while they said we are on track to meet our Kyoto requirement. They're now yelling that from the rooftops thanks to the recession. However, they were claiming it before because of simply wealth transfers. They were buying. Did you know that China had these old refrigerant plants producing HFCs, very powerful greenhouse gases? And China said to Europe, I just reopened this plant. You need to reduce emissions. You can't do it. I could close this plant down, give you a piece of paper that said you reduced emissions, and you could give me a bag of money. And that's actually how the Kyoto Clean Development Mechanism works. That story was broken by the Herald Tribune, of all unlikely sources. So here's out of that article about Exelon. Exelon needs that legislation to happen sooner rather than later. Without a carbon price of some sort, that's code for energy tax. Exelon's fortunes aren't so bright. Its profits depend on power prices. There's nothing that's going to drive Exelon's profit in the next couple of years wildly. It just isn't going to happen, said the CEO, according to the journalist who interviewed him, except, of course, carbon legislation. And because of that, the company views spending on lobbying for legislation almost like a capital expense. And it goes into how the CEO is spending his time in Washington. That's how you run a company. Exelon discloses that it expects a revenue boost of $1.1 billion a year if carbon is priced at $15 a ton. That won't do anything, so expect much more. Exelon would gain simply because the price on carbon would raise the cost of production for fossil fuel-powered electricity. Most of that would be passed on to customers, of course. That's why the folks lobbying for this include the utilities. Exelon would just get to charge a lot more for its power. That's the point. When somebody says, some of America's biggest companies, why even these guys, as if it's this Nixon goes to China moment. No, it's not. It's simple rent-seeking. Now, finishing up, green jobs. That's the new reason. This is a energy tax to create jobs bill now. This is, or the Stanley Greenberg poll that cured global warming. Stanley Greenberg was Bill Clinton's pollster. He conducted a poll that I cite in the book, reported on by the New York Times even, in which he found something very stunning to me. He said, it turns out the public aren't buying global warming. They're not buying cap and trade. You need to call it something else. And he said, pull it back, rebrand it, roll it back out, and call it green jobs and clean energy. Which should sound familiar, because that's actually precisely what they did. You know about Frederick Bastiat, the man who said, if employment's the goal, let's cut off everybody's left hand. Think we'll have to hire twice as many workers. He also said, let's pay these children, essentially through one of his stories, he said, we'll pay these children to run around town smashing windows, because think of all the jobs in the glazing industry that will be created, and you will still have a full window pane at the end of the day. Your wallet will be a little bit lighter of money that would have been put to productive uses, which is now being transferred to maybe the former vice president of this town, who's now very concerned about the dangers of non-renewable window panels or something. He did it, he made fun of this argument 200-something years ago. And now you can see, if the state mandated voice-operated cheese graters or in-house masseuses, there would be booms in the voice-operated cheese grater installation industry or the massage industry. It wouldn't create economic growth. My congressman for now, Tom Perriello, a freshman who voted for cap and trade and said on the radio on July 6th, those people who said this will cost jobs aren't living in the real world. The people in the real world know that we are hemorrhaging jobs to India and China because they've already done it. A surprise to the Indians and the Chinese. But what he's saying is, if the state mandates something, of course, it's axiomatic. Nobody disputes that you'll create jobs in pulling trains down railway tracks or in getting as many people as you can to pull an aircraft to try to get it to take off. You're not, however, creating economic growth. What are you doing? Is that all that happens? Is that all that happens? And the answer is a resounding no. For example, the president said 8 times, think about what's happening in countries like Spain. 8 times he said this to tell us what he had in mind for us for a centrally planned green economy. And that's all green jobs agendas are. It's central planning with a splash of green paint. Well, some academics in Spain dared take him up on this, and they produced this report, led by Professor Gabriel Calzada, a guy who used to run a major utility, I think E.ON or RWE's renewable energy business in Spain, and then a research assistant. And they found that the Spanish green jobs bubble was just that. It was a bubble. The state created an industry that would only survive. It's a census job. The jobs only exist so long as the state's interest in, mandate for, and subsidy of the job continues. And the minute that subsidy is pulled, the jobs disappear. So you have to constantly put enormous sums in every year just to keep the bubble afloat. And if you actually want growth, you've got a real problem. For example, 570,000 euros per green job was the average subsidy. Now remember, this is mostly make work. That's the subsidy. You're not paying caulkers and windmill installers 570,000 euros, or this is about $800,000 at the time. It was $800,000 for a windmill job, sometimes up to $1 million subsidy per some of the green jobs created by the Spanish state. The one that the president told us 8 times to think about if we wanted to know what his green economy looked like. These folks, these authors, found that in Spain, just in the opportunity cost, the jobs not created by the money that was taken out of the public sector, out of the economy and put to make work, they killed 2.2 jobs that would have been created by the private sector. Because essentially the private sector creates a job, a real job, in response to demand, steel, much more cheaply than does the state. Now, the other way you kill jobs is those steel jobs left. So you avoided 2.2 jobs for every job created by the state. The jobs created by the state were temporary. The jobs killed were real. And then they chased away energy-intensive jobs. This report is great reading, by the way, and it quotes this former CEO Munoz. You're killing steel jobs, real jobs as well, on top. In Italy, Carlos De Niro and his colleague from Bruno Leone, the Institute, Bruno Leone, wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about 3 weeks ago, detailing how they found in Italy, for reasons peculiar to the Italian economy, they killed 4.8 jobs per job created, just in opportunity cost, and so on. So,
will America watch as the clean energy jobs and industries of the future flourish in countries like Spain, Japan, or Germany? Think about what's happening in countries like Spain, Germany, and Japan, where they're making real investments in renewable energy. Spain generates almost 30% of its power by harnessing the wind, while we manage less than 1%.
But a new report out of Spain says that if that country is any indication, Americans shouldn't be depending on green jobs to help the U.S. economy.
You're being held out as this great green country. Your studies show that the green jobs it's an absolute nightmare.
Professor Gabriel Calzada Alvarez has released a study with startling claims about what's happened in Spain and what he predicts will play out here.
The study in Spain was concluded.
Calzada says for every green job that's created with the help of government funding, 2.2 regular jobs are lost.
They lost 2 jobs for every green job they created.
Turns out for every green job created there was a loss of 2.2 jobs. For every 1 job created, twice as many jobs lost there.
And that only 1 in 10 green jobs winds up being permanent.
Unemployment now is at 17.8% in Spain.
For every 1 job created by green technology,
2.2 jobs were lost in Spain.
It is really difficult to understand why would a country like the US with relatively low unemployment want to learn how to create jobs from a country like Spain, which has the record of unemployment rate in the developed countries.
Spain had 18% unemployment at the time. Now it's over 20%. And that's without... They're a curious case because their punitive taxation system has created this tremendous underground economy. It's tough to tell, but youth unemployment is vastly higher than ours. Their admitted unemployment's over 20% now. And it's for reasons like this. The president thought no one would check. But in Denmark, which, by the way, he changed. He stopped saying Spain, Germany, and Japan when this came out. Robert Gibbs was asked a question at a White House press briefing by a Fox News reporter, what do you think about this? And he said, I haven't read the report, but I disagree with it. So the president stopped saying, think about what's happening in Spain, Germany, and Japan, and he started saying, think about what's happening in Denmark, Germany, and Japan. So CEPOS, a very establishment think tank, did a study and found out that Denmark's situation was like Spain's, as was Germany's, according to this RWISN, a state-funded, old-line, almost 100-year-old think tank that looked into Germany's experience at the president's urging. Well, how was this dealt with? Bill Clinton went to Madrid and gave a speech, and he said, so now there's a study, as I said, you're going to have to deal with in Spain. And it turned out they dealt with it in a very old-fashioned way. Gabriel Calzada has lost his summer university. That is something, he's a president of a think tank. They lost this summer university. He has had his classes cut in half. He has had threats because the renewable energy industry and the utilities funded in part his university. Many entities did. It's a private university. They tried to get him fired by threatening they would not support the university anymore. The education minister called the rector of the university 3 times to get him fired. Okay? The head of the Communist Trade Union and the president of the Wind Energy Association in Spain wrote pieces saying he was unpatriotic. Not for what he said, but because he said it. They said, we need America to do this or our jobs will disappear. We created a bubble. That's their defense, by the way. But they said he's unpatriotic, and that line appeared several times. The administration here, again using FOIA, we found out what they did. And Al Gore's former CEO, Kathy Zoe, who quit her $325,000 a year job as Al Gore's CEO to become a heavily financially conflicted Assistant Secretary of Energy. You'll read more about that later. But her husband is with a company that is benefiting from green jobs programs. And she, it turned out, has kept $500,000 in smart meter stock. I only found this out because somebody passed me her financial disclosure documents, and we're waiting on her logs from the ethics officer at DOE, and somebody has already provided me her recusals, so I know what they were and weren't. She's gone. But in the meantime, she, and I found this out through getting emails under FOIA, she told DOE to sic this taxpayer-funded NREL, National Renewable Energy Laboratories, on Calzada et al. And they produced a study complaining that he didn't use this Leontiev method that's used by central planners, developed a little to the east of us several decades ago, method for input-output. And he was using 2 different models to achieve the same result, used by people who invest their own money. So they said it's not really applicable to the circumstance. In a way, they're right. And their other criticism was he refused to speculate about the future, and the future was good. This is Spain. Actually, a royal decree emerged in April of last year affirming the study and saying that this rate deficit, their electricity prices skyrocketed 60%, and they couldn't let the consumer deal with the actual cost of producing green energy, so they hid another 33% increase incurred in debt that would have to be paid off by subsequent generations. You just keep growing it and kicking it down. We're familiar with this. The rate deficit, mainly caused by the feed-in tariff system to support renewable energies, quote, this is a royal decree in April, acknowledging this, that the president said, I haven't read, or his spokesman, I haven't read it, but I disagree with it, and then they sicked NREL on him, is deeply harming the system and puts at risk not only the financial situation of the electric sector companies, but also the sustainability of our system itself. This disadjustment turns out to be unsustainable. The Sustainable Jobs Energy Program is itself unsustainable and has grave consequences. This is a royal decree. Since it deteriorates the security and financial capacity of the investments necessary for providing electricity at the levels of quality and security that the Spanish society demands. That is, the wind doesn't always blow and the sun doesn't always shine. They say, well, when the wind is free, that's true, but wind power is bloody expensive, and they ignore that part. Well, the Spanish government acknowledged it. So I want you to remember, think about what's happening in countries like Spain. This is a story from about a month ago, May 12th. President Obama calls Zapatero and tells him to turn off the spigot of public debt because they're going to be the next Greece and they'll take us down with them. Well, the Spanish government looked and they found out where the debt was. And it was the Green Jobs Program that the president is pumping on the gas harder here while telling them to pump the brakes. He's got a fundamental transformation to effect. They need to not drag us down with them. So the president is now aware. He has called Zapatero and said, you got to cut it out. The bubble has burst. This is what happened. The Spanish government, the German government, and the Danish government have said, we've got a problem, we've got to cut off the subsidies. By the way, in the ultimate irony, we also found out that Denmark has one national park, and it's a forest, and they're clearing it to build experimental wind turbines. And chasing people out of their homes to do so. There are some living there. It turns out that kilo is Danish for kilo. This is La Gazeta 2 weeks ago, a full-page story in a Spanish newspaper, and the headline translated is, Spain admits green economy as sold to Obama is a disaster. Es una ruina. You can't hide from this anymore, and yet, what are they doing? They're planning on voting on this in the Senate in July. They're not blinking, they're not pumping the brakes, they don't care. It's not about the climate, it's not about jobs. That's an excuse. Here's what it's about. It's an economic restructuring bill for the global economy. We should not pretend that it isn't. That's the spokesman for the Blue-Green Coalition of unions and green groups. Let's not pretend it isn't. I agree. This is what the UK taxpayer-funded group, the Tyndall Centre, called it in a memo leaked to the press, the planned recession strategy. Planned recession could avoid catastrophic climate change. Britain will have to stop building airports, switch to electric cars, and shut down coal-fired power stations. You may notice a tension between the last two. As part of a planned recession to avoid dangerous climate change. They're coming out of the woodwork to say, okay, so this is going to hurt a little, but I assure you, if I didn't do this, it would be much, much worse. So remember, Van Jones said, we want to move from suicidal great capitalism. So the green economy will start off as a small subset, and we're going to push it and push it and push it until it becomes the engine for, wait for it, transforming the whole society. You may have heard that one before. That's what it's about. Again, in closing, remember, unless they're all lying to you, it's about fundamentally transforming the whole society. No one says it would detectably impact the climate. It's unreasonable to think it's about the climate. So here, the issue isn't the issue. They're not anti-offshore drilling. They're not anti-shale. They're not anti-nuclear. They're anti-energy. And in the politically correct guide, I just quote them and quote them and quote them and ask you, why would they all be lying about this? They've declared ideological war on all domestic energy sources that work. The administration has now declared war on Appalachian coal in the name of the mayfly, which lives 24 hours. True story. So, they've declared war on all energy sources that work. They vowed higher electricity and gas prices. The Secretary of Energy, Stephen Chu, said somehow we need to find a way to get our gas prices up to Europe's level. Well, we all pay the same for a barrel of oil. I wonder what way we could use. Maybe Europe's way. Taxation. Cap and trade, and of course moratoria, but they're just a, what are they calling it, a pause? As in pause, wait for laughter. Those rigs will, of course, those drilling rigs will go elsewhere. Cap and trade is not an environment bill, according to its lead co-sponsor. You are absolutely right. It's really about what it would do. What it would do is install a long-held policy wish list that's been demanded by a list of usual suspects for decades in the name of every thread, greatest and otherwise. That's what it's about. It's about your liberties. It's about your power. It's about stealing your freedom and bankrupting America. It's not about national security, green jobs, or anything else. So with that, if it's okay, I'll take, if there are any, take some questions. Otherwise, give you my contact information.
We'll take a couple questions, and after Q&A, Mr. Horner will be outside signing some copies of his books. So please don't forget to buy your copy outside and get it signed.
Thank you. Germany, I used to study there. It's covered by clouds half the year, and they put tremendous amount of solar panels. Do the Germans feel, what's the reaction inside the country? Do they know this? Do they feel they've been suckered? The idiocy of it all?
Yes,
is there because
in other markets, you can still sell people, as someone said, rope to hang themselves with. You don't have to mandate it here. Germany is realizing that they have to cut the subsidies back or they will go broke.
You have a question over here?
Yes, sir.
In the last couple of months, President Obama has at least paid some lip service to the idea of supporting the development of nuclear power in this country. How are we to interpret that in the light of his other statements, which seem, you know, be interested in your comments on it?
Yeah, during the campaign he said, this is a quote, "I am not a proponent of nuclear power." That has not changed. What he did was he said, in the political run-up to trying to get an energy bill passed, he said, I support loan guarantees for 2 reactors. Therefore, I'm pro-nuclear. Look at me. You can cut an energy bill. Deal with me. The problem is his own economic assumptions for cap and trade to keep the cost to about $3,500 per family for a household of 4 per year. His own economic assumptions to keep the cost down assumed 100 new reactors fairly near term. So he's not actually serious about, this was spun by the media as he's meeting Republicans halfway. He met himself 2% of the way. It was a head feint, kind of like his offshore claims before the incident.
Chris, the movement of the government, the movement of environmental alarmist groups is predictable and will never change. I see the biggest problem are the greedy capitalist corporations that care not at all for the citizenry, but only the profits. What can we do about that?
That's, you nail it, Jay. This was an issue that wasn't going anywhere until some folks realized they could help it along and benefit. Right now, it still has currency for a staunchly anti-market, anti-capitalist president to say why some of America's biggest companies support this as cover. We need to get people to start asking why. I've got, you know, my simple ideas are that we need to write something, maybe a book, 10 companies that want to increase your taxes, 10 companies that want to increase your energy taxes. Enron has got to stick to their heel like toilet paper out of the men's room. They have got to be stuck to Enron and BP. They've been the 8 figures from BP, the green groups. 8 figures. And this is not stuck to them yet. So we have a lot to do. We're very undermanned, we're right, we're smarter, we're better, but we're fighting a very well-funded machine. So we're sort of in the center. We're, you know, sort of like the guys in Bastogne. They got us surrounded, the unlucky fill-in-the-blanks. We've got to put out every single fire, and one of them is this cover they're seizing of companies that haven't tarnished their name like Enron and BP, saying, well, they supported it, must be a good idea. I guess we've just got to keep banging the drum, and if we can find a creative way to point out, we'll quote them. They're saying they will make billions per year. Where does the money come from? Off of whom? I mean, I'm sorry I wish I had a pithier answer. I can just yell Enron and walk out the room, and sometimes that works. It used to.
I like your book, 10 companies that are trying to steal your money. Yeah, great.
Everybody went out to the executive.
What effect does the campaign finance law have on it that allows a PAC to give unlimited funds to political campaigns, but doesn't allow individuals to support candidates beyond a couple $1,000s.
Rationing speech would not be good for us generally. Rationing speech designed by people who also share this agenda is potentially catastrophic for us. The recent ruling that rolled a little bit of that back, I haven't seen anybody all that enthusiastic about taking advantage of it yet. But the fact of the matter is we are heavily outfunded. You would think maybe that limiting Soros's ability would be good for us. But in fact, he's very clever. He and his doppelgangers have created 50 groups that share essentially 50 common individuals who will sit on their boards and otherwise drive them. So I'm going to say that in the final analysis it doesn't have any impact, because after, Mark has the figure, but it's billions we've been outspent, tens of billions, and we haven't lost yet.
I'm not talking about the restricting corporate contributions. I'm talking about removing the restrictions on personal contributions.
Well, like I say,
a corporation is a monomaniac. He has a business goal. An individual is a person who can support politicians who they don't agree with them on some particular issue. It seems to me that these campaign finance laws favor monomaniacs against individual citizens with a balanced view of the and patriotic commitment.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. The impact of it, I actually haven't seen, there's some people in the room who might have different opinions, but I haven't seen any real enthusiasm for taking advantage of that yet. I could be proven wrong. Again, we're living in interesting times, and a lot of people know they're very close to getting their desired society. They may just open the floodgates. I agree with your analysis. I don't know what the impact will be. I haven't seen anything. But again, I remain just somewhat optimistic because we have been outspent in the tens of billions and somehow haven't lost.
Do you think there's any truth to the story that the oil rig in the Gulf was torpedoed with the concept that given this horrible environmental problem that we now have, we should not be building any more oil rigs?
I will say that I know nothing about the first part, but the second, there are cynics who seize this immediately to say, well, I was willing to go halfway with you, but I just can't now. And I think it's biting him. The president seizing this as a way, let's say it happened. Let's start at that point in the timeline. It happened. I think it's coming back to bite him, with Democratic senators saying, in my state alone, you're talking about killing 330,000 jobs just in my state, just with your offshore moratorium. This will be a political albatross around the administration's neck for several reasons. I'll just let you know that I've got 4 FOIA requests pending. One is the same with 4 different division and district offices of the Army Corps, asking for internal discussions and any reference to any Green Group involvement in Governor Jindal's request for permits to dredge and build barrier shoals, berms, aisles. Because we know the Greens were opposed to it, and we know that for some reason it was refused for several weeks. FOIA is there to answer questions. I'm asking them. The other 3 are with EPA, NOAA, and the Coast Guard. There were groups like Defenders of Wildlife who publicly insisted, you cannot burn this off. I know there's a plan in place. I know it's been there since '94. I know there's no bureaucratic reason to wait. It's a pre-approved plan. Before the VOCs and other things evaporate and the oil gets too well mixed, you can ignite it and reduce dramatically that which reaches the shore. And you didn't do it. Why? The only other factor I know is that groups were screaming to the heavens, don't do it. It will be catastrophe if this reaches the shore, but don't do it. It's their standard lack of measure, lack of proportion or perspective. Millions will die from coal, but your nuclear power cannot be part of the solution. They have no sense of perspective. Or is this like other years we've seen where the Green Group said, you know, the environmental damage is real but temporary. The financial advantages are inescapable if bad things happen. And they've had great years when bad things happen. And we also know the administration, I don't know the answer to the question, I'm asking the question, what was the Green Group involvement with the refusal to ignite as you had pre-approval to do? Because that right there would have stopped an awful lot of the oil reaching the shores, which is the problem. the government obviously can't cap a well, but the government can be involved either through providing resources they've seized or claimed or declared authorities. It's not anti-small government, by the way, to tell them, you've claimed the authority, do your job. That hypocrisy, claim of hypocrisy, is being thrown in our face. That's not the case. We're just saying, why didn't you do your job? The government can mitigate damage through providing resources and getting out of the way and giving permits, and they have done none of that well. So I answered the question I wish I was asked, and I hope that works.
We have one more question, and then you'll have a chance to get your books.
Wonderful presentation. I definitely am going to get that book from you. And but I object to calling companies like Enron or BP capitalist entities. They seem much more like corporate socialist entities. Perhaps public-private partnership should be correctly defined as a fascist type of system. I know it's not a pretty word, but it really seems to be. That's how we are being victimized. It's either through some type of socialism, and these companies are certainly not free market capitalists. Comment on that, please.
Yeah, I've heard some of my colleagues like Fred Smith give very eloquent answers to in defense of capitalism and the claim that Enron's rent-seeking and market socialism, which is what cap and trade is capitalism. I will defer to them on that, but I will say that this is, again, simply because buying and selling are involved doesn't make something a market mechanism. They have seized the language, which is what they're expert at doing. And they have claimed that which doesn't exist as theirs. And so I sympathize. I don't consider rent-seeking to be any sort of market mechanism. I don't consider it capitalism. I consider it something that occurs in our system of representative democracy, but something we could hopefully cure through transparency. And I have to tell you, there's the Washington Post writer and Michael Weiskopf with Newsweek. Weiskopf called my colleague Myron E. Bell and said, so tell me how Enron got Bush to reject Kyoto. And so Myron spent an hour with him explaining how Bush rejected Kyoto by adopting the Clinton-Gore position of not pursuing ratification, which is what they should have said, in spite of Enron's lobbying. And he went on for about an hour, and Weiskopf said, now, tell me how Enron got Bush to reject Kyoto. And I sat down with the Washington Post reporter, I forget his name. It may have been Dan Balls. He's the guy who wrote the story around Christmas of the year of the downfall. And at the end of it, I was explaining how, I have this guy muttering on the street corner about this evil company that everybody loves, and beware, they're evil. And then suddenly, everybody wanted to talk to me. Oh, you said Enron was evil. Tell me why. And I explained it to him. And it was, well, they were trying to use the state to create energy scarcity and even energy poverty in the name of the Loch Ness Monster, and that's not a good thing. And he said, I suppose I could say you're telling me maybe they weren't that bad after all? This is where people get their news, or Jon Stewart. So who gives us a fairer shake than they do? So we have getting Enron and BP, rent-seeking and market socialism divorced from the notion of capitalism is a lift that we're not going to get any media assistance in accomplishing. But I understand, and you know what? It's true. Capitalists ultimately, Schumpeter said the capitalists ultimately will not defend capitalism, and he's proving right. They're, in many cases, proving to be its worst enemies. And we're finding their government, I have a whole speech on this, but their government affairs people, the ones who are up there cutting the deals and saying, you know how you'd be smart in Washington? You say, well, you can't just say no. Send this guy back to a history class, okay? Sometimes you actually have no choice but to say no. But yes, you can say no. Well, if you're not on the table, you're on the menu. You're the menu. You are the menu. If you haven't figured that out and had the gravy bath and apple stuck in your mouth, I can't help you. And then there's something along the lines of how we have to negotiate away. What we have to do is design a nice scaffolding here for when they hang us, okay? And these are people who view the wealth-creating aspect of their company as well as the economy with great suspicion. And yet they're not raised through the wealth-creating aspect of the company. And they are instead raised as part of the political class and then hired to be company A as government affairs representative negotiating with people that he wants to make like him, as opposed to defend the company's interests. And again, you're not at the table. There's something to this. If you're not at the table, you're on the menu thing. There's only something to it in that you're actually not at the table. In theory, under our system, you are. Our elected representatives are our representatives at the table, except they're not. They're quite clearly not. And that's the biggest problem I have. We will have to defend capitalism, since the capitalists, for whatever reason, some systemic, some philosophical, some out of ignorance, just won't. I could go on. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Horner. And thank you, everybody, for coming tonight. Go get your books and then go get some sleep, because we're starting early. Breakfast will be at 7:30. Continental breakfast at 7:30. First presentation starts 8 a.m. sharp. Back downstairs where we were earlier today. Good night.
Jeremy, could you ask?